All right, well, welcome back to the Future Human Experience. We're here with a very special guest, Jennifer Fondrevay. Thank you so much for joining me on this conversation today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Well, not only are you a thought leader, consultant, a speaker in the space, but you're also an author of a wonderful book called Now What? You wrote a survival's guide. Tell us a little bit more about the survival's guide.
Well, and I actually got picked on a bit for calling it a survivor's guide, right? I was told, particularly early in my speaking career, don't call it a survivor's guide because then executives won't hire you. They'll think you're coming at this from against the establishment point of view. But what has been refreshing is that it's both a survivor's guide, but a handbook for executive leaders on what happens to people in times of change and uncertainty. And the book essentially was born from my experience of going through 3 multi-billion-dollar M&A deals, which were not successful. And after the first M&A deal, and in that one, I was the head of B2B marketing at a company called Navtech, digital map maker. Maps are ubiquitous now, but they were not back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so I had the privilege of launching maps in Europe and Asia. And we were acquired by Nokia in 2008. And I thought it was going to be a transformative deal, and it turned out not to be. And so that was really my origin story. When people ask me, so how'd you come up with an idea to write an M&A survivor's handbook? It was really that. I just saw that the lack of a people strategy, the fact that Nokia was B2C and we were B2B, that culture tension, the role that played in undermining our integration and the overall success of the deal. So the book, frankly, was all I was going to do was write a book. I was only going to be an author. But when I interviewed CEOs for the book, CEOs, CFOs, private equity, they just kept saying, what are you doing besides the book? What you talk about is really important to deal success and doesn't typically get covered. And so that's why I'm sitting here across from you, Eric, because I didn't just stop with a book.
Awesome. Well, Jennifer, just to give some context to our audience, right? So when we talk about B2B, we're talking about business to business. So those are conversations, negotiations you're having across, within the industry. And then when you're talking B2C, it's the business directly to a consumer. Okay, directly to a consumer. Yeah. So those are completely different relationships, different business models. Okay.
They are.
One of the things that I also find fascinating about your work is that you've been in this space as the world is getting more digitized as well. Yeah. Right? And one of your examples is exactly that. How do you see now your perspective as you've been navigating this and sharing your insights in your book around the world? What has this digital world that seems to be moving at a rapid pace done to these conversations about transition?
It's actually made it more important because I was already dealing with emotions, the emotions that people experience when going through transition. I focused on mergers and acquisitions because that was my lived experience, but it's a transition that you can go through in a company when things are changing. This could be new leadership, reorg. I mean, I'm confident, you've had a great corporate career. A reorg seems like it happens every 8 months, right? You get moved to a new team. That's a transition. Now, adding to that, and there was already the digital transformation transition that I feel like was just anything that was happening in your company that had some semblance of digital, it was a digital transformation. Now AI is equally having that influence. So the emotions that people experience are now even ratcheted up because now my worry is, how do I work with AI? How do I make sure that AI doesn't replace me? I keep hearing all the benefits, but all I see are the potential threats to me and my experience. So it's actually amplified the work that I do.
And Jennifer, you bring up a great perspective too about how we respond to these transitions. And sometimes we respond to these transitions in a very defensive way, right? Of saying, hey, if this is going to happen to my job or to my company, because there's so many questions, the best way I could respond is not lean into it and not understand the benefits or try to listen to benefits. I'm trying to figure out, well, how is this impacting me in a negative way? And I focus possibly on that more than
Oh no, not even
impact.
Just possibly. I'm the poster child for that, right? When NAFTech was acquired, the leadership that I loved and adored either left, got pushed out. It was a tough time because it was really a leadership that I had admired. I'd had the same boss for 7 years, which I know I now recognize how lucky I was to have that. And so the book that I wrote was more, it started out as lessons learned, right? I absolutely, particularly with the Nokia NAVTech acquisition, I held on to the past because I had been valued. My value was through the work I had done in B2B, right? And so when you have these conversations, when you're acquired and you keep feeling as though you're not valued, you think, well, you all spent $9 billion on us. Like you have to think, there's got to be some value that we bring, but the conversations tend to be, no, we're going to do it this way. And then that was even more frustrating because we were B2B. And I kept having to re-explain, represent how B2B marketing works versus B2C. But my book comes from my own lessons learned, things I know I did badly. And one of the things was recognizing you have a hard time moving forward because you're still holding on to the past. You still think your whole worth is based on your past achievements without really understanding, okay, that's brought me to here. I now need to see where the opportunities are for me moving forward. And that was the TEDx talk that I did, right? Embrace uncertainty to create opportunity. And until you embrace it,
I love it.
It's really hard. And so after that first acquisition, it wasn't perfect, the next one. The next one I was on the other side where the team I inherited had been acquired. But I knew how they were feeling because I had been that person. And so it was after that second acquisition that I thought, I should say I was told by other people, you really need to write a book, right? Like there's leadership lessons here. But it comes from my own journey of having screwed up and not embracing at the beginning, you know? You think your self-worth is based on what you achieved before. And today, as you pointed out, with digital, things are moving so fast. You know, you have to pivot.
One of the things that a good friend of ours shared not too long ago, one of the things he says is that the slowest rate of change you will ever feel is today, right? So like from here on out, it's just going faster and faster.
Which, like how is that possible? Right, doesn't it feel like way?
That's the exponential rate that we're at, right? I mean, we as human beings are not used to exponential changes, right? We're like, as human beings, we've grown up to even just moving outside of where we grew up is very difficult, right? Very difficult, right? And now we're starting to normalize it. And then eventually it was like, well, what is your career going to be like? Well, my career is more than likely going to be either something like my parents or something like around my neighbors.
Right.
It doesn't change from that, right? And so now because of our ability to at least access or acquire or learn in different spaces, we're starting to open that up a bit. We're about to get 1 billion more people connected to the internet by the end of this decade. What does that look like, right? For not only businesses, for startups, our consumers, how are we working with other businesses, et cetera. And then also the measuring is also changing. I think one of the things that I find fascinating about your work too is that one of the things at the pace that we're used to going might have been like quarter to quarter, right? We would talk to leaders or we would talk to companies, or companies would talk to their investors at a certain pace that we had also just normalized.
Right.
Well, that has changed. I mean, if you're going to tell me that the world has not changed in the last month, right? I mean, we're having this recording in the middle of August. Beginning of July was very different. July 4th weekend, we had this thought of how the world was going to look like by the end of this year, at least specifically in our country. And now it's very different. right? Because of certain things that have been happening externally, right?
Which is why I say embrace uncertainty.
Correct.
Because it's
absolutely. And so that's what I want to dive into a little bit more, right, with you, Jen, because reflecting on that insight, that was also one of the things that happened to me in my career was I started realizing when I went through the first dramatic change in corporation, I had a job in the oil and gas industry, and I loved it. I loved it. It was a company I was with since I was 19 years old. I was an intern with them. I would recruit for them. I had their socks, their pajamas. I had everything, right? Like I was like the go-to to talk about that company. And then all of a sudden our team was impacted, and I was like, wait, what just happened?
Yeah.
And I was like, wait, but I thought it was, this is where my value comes from. It comes from my title, from this work. And that wasn't the reality. And then when I came and restarted my career in the tech sector, they actually asked me to change as well and say, hey, what you want to go and stretch yourself and do something new? And I was like, no. I don't want to do that because last time I did that, I got burnt. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until those leaders created that environment and say, no, the way you grow here is you embrace that, right? And so they started not looking at their employees as an asset for their only exclusively their team, but for the entire company and for the industry.
Yeah.
Right. And saying the way you keep Eric or the way you keep this team is you help them grow into these new spaces that we haven't even explored yet.
Yeah.
And that was not only a breath of fresh air for me, but that like re-inspired me into, wow, this is what leaders could do in organizations and companies. And again, I know it's very rare because that is why a book like yours is so special, not only when it came out, but it's even more relevant today, where we're seeing all these changes that are happening in these companies. So Jen, if you tell me, or let's dive into that concept a little bit more about embracing transition. Today we're hearing about companies that are either growing or sometimes shrinking at massive levels. Sometimes they're even asking people to move into different spaces or move geographies or what have you. What type of guidance do you give, one, a leader that's navigating through this, right? That's going to be with the remaining employees in those organizations. Or two, what guidance do you give even the employees that decide that have the opportunity to stay in a particular company, but that might look very different in the next 3 to 6 months?
Right. Well, it's interesting. One of the things that I focus on with leaders, predominantly leaders going through a merger and acquisition, but even just transition in general. And I'll say, too often leaders will say, isn't this an amazing thing, right? We're now going to be able to offer all these things to our customers. We now have a portfolio of products. The leadership is all excited, but the frontline leaders aren't thinking any of that. Like it's Charlie Brown's teacher. They don't even hear it because what they're thinking is, do I still have a job? Is my title going to be the same? Will I be with the same team? What is my wife going to think? What is my husband going to think? What does this mean to me? So it changes, exactly as you said, your scenario where you painted out how excited you were for the company. It was all about the company. But in that one moment, your employees are not thinking about the company. They're thinking about themselves. And as a leader, if you don't recognize that, you've already jumped 6 levels ahead of them by saying, isn't this an amazing thing? This is so great what we can offer to a customer. And they're thinking, it's not we, it's I. And so a lot of the work that I do is first just saying, you've got to recognize that, particularly when in a merger and acquisition where you can have deal negotiations last 4 months. So you've been in it for a while. But when it gets announced to people, it's new news to them. Right. They're confronted with it.
Or there's rumors about it that are starting and no one could say anything.
And you don't know, well, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? And then when it finally happens, not to get morbid, but oftentimes I will equate it to a funeral, the loss of someone. I've now lost the company that I knew, and I don't know what it's turning into. And so all of these emotions that leadership are not used to having happen in a corporate environment, I'll say you can ignore them, but you ignore them at your peril because people need to evolve through, they need to transition through that. It is though they are grieving the loss of the company that they knew, and now they need to, I do honor and release ceremonies, and one of them is honor the company that you were part of and release that so you can pivot and move forward. And it's been some of the most powerful work that I've done, it's not for every company. It has to have a very self-aware leader who says, I want to do that ceremony because it allows the leadership of that company to say, this is what I valued and loved about our company. Here's what I thought was great. You will inevitably also have leaders saying, here's what sucked. You know, here's what wasn't working. And it even allows them to digest. There's huge opportunity with this new company if we lean into that and try to make that work, as opposed to resist it and hold on to the past. And that kind of a ceremony helps. So, you know, just going back to your question, it's really the emotional piece of transition. Change is one thing. And it's actually William Bridges, who wrote the book Managing Transitions. Seminal work, love it. I talk about his work in my book, but it's about that change. People don't resist change as much, but a transition is what a human being goes through when they're letting go of something else to move forward and begin anew.
And Jennifer, that reminds, I mean, you just added a really interesting wrinkle that I had not considered too, was sometimes these leaders, as they're talking about these mergers or this transition that's about to happen, let's just leave it in that area. If they're talking about the idea or the concept of it, it probably has been already taking place for some time.
Yes.
And so they've probably already navigated some of those emotions themselves.
Yes.
I'm like, oh, wow, I have to go through this. Okay, and they're navigating it. But you're right, when the employees find out, it's like brand new news.
Yes.
And so giving them that same time and grace that you gave yourself as you were navigating through this is just as important, if not even more important.
Yeah.
Because they're in the front lines.
Yeah. And it's, I go back to other work that's been done. So the helping people get from denial to acceptance, right? The stages of grief, I call them the M&A stages of transition. And it's exactly as you said. The leadership's already at acceptance. They've been working on this for a while, but you need to give your employees that same period. And some people will be right there. Yeah. They've accepted it. They're excited. Those will be your change agents who embrace it. But you may have somebody, and particularly what I've seen is when it's someone who's had long tenure with the company that's been acquired, they helped build it. I see this a lot with family-owned businesses. They will struggle. And so helping that person or people to move forward is a critical part of what a leader needs to do. And so that's the work that I do, is helping leadership understand there's a different set of tools in their toolkit. When you're on a rapid growth trajectory, it's one style of leadership with certain tools. But when you're navigating the emotional roller coaster of change and transition, you need to pull out different tools. And that's what I work on with leaders, is to not only have them see that, but make sure they've got the right tools in the toolkit.
Jennifer, now that we're going into this, it seems that after COVID, well, actually, I would say probably during COVID in the 2020s, we heard a lot of companies laying off employees, transitioning employees, going into this hybrid model, remote model.
Yeah.
And then eventually in office and et cetera, et cetera. And then now we're also seeing some transitions happening for a lot of companies. Some of them growing, but most of them starting to either embrace this new era of AI, so therefore their product structure is probably changing or their strategy is changing. So that's impacting a lot of employees in different sectors. With that said, when a significant amount of employees or products or teams transition out of a company, the company that stays behind is still relatively a new company, right?
It is.
And so do you recommend still, for when you're talking about those tools into your toolbox for leaders, they're very similar tools that they should be utilizing in this space as well?
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting, just as you were talking, I did an article a couple years ago about just handling people in the exit. And in the context of mergers and acquisitions, when you let people go, more often than not, I'll say it's like musical chairs. It's not necessarily that they were bad employees. It's just the company's pivoting and moving in a new direction. And now is either, frankly, sometimes they're cutting and they're still not even sure, it's musical chairs, truly. Music stops and you might not have a chair. How you treat those people in the exit not only will be taken in by the people who stay, but if you treat them well and with grace and you honor the role that they played, you can have a whole different set of advocates for your company when they leave. And so I will say, and this is not just HR's job, right? As a leader, how you treat people when they go will be rewarded in kind if you treat them as you would like to be treated. And I'm married to a lawyer. So I say that because a lot of times people say, oh, but compliance and regulations. There is nothing that binds you to not treat people like a human being and to treat someone as you would like to be treated. I don't think that's going to get you arrested or in a lawsuit. And I have talked to my husband about this a lot. And he's actually said, I think it's, unfortunately, people feel like they can't say anything. But I just highlight that point because how you treat people at the exit has repercussions and can have very positive ones.
Jennifer, tell us a little bit more about that, because you're right. Sometimes because we're going through these transitions, really in the spirit of doing the right thing, we try to script these exits as much as possible, right? We try to say, hey, you know what? We want to honor them. We want to do all this stuff. But these are the 5 things we could do in a standard way to serve these particular employees that are going through this transition. Again, it's coming from a good heart and a good place, but that not necessarily is as authentic as it could be in being of service to those employees as well.
Yeah, and so that's why, frankly, I even just emphasize, right, having a dialogue with the leadership. There are people who we will have to let go, treating them humanely and treating them with grace. And how do we optimize this? So we have them as advocates for our company even as they are leaving. You can do that if you have that type of a conversation. But exactly as you said, it has to be intentional. You need to think it through, know what you can and can't say. But there are ways to say it where it doesn't feel like a scripted. And so you will be escorted out of, there's more that can be done there.
Love that. So Jennifer, I mean, you've been sharing with all of us your insights and your passion in the space, but what is your origin story in this? I mean, you shared with us a little bit about what happened with Nokia, but what else has been your inspiration to really continue this work and inspire all of us to make sure we're leaning into this?
It's equally fascinating to me because the job that I do doesn't really exist. There's I don't have a template to follow. I'm a change agent with cultural sensitivities, and I wrote a survivor's handbook about mergers and acquisitions. And I would say over time, I've realized that I'm doing what I was always meant to do, and I just didn't know that this is what I would be building towards. I'm an accidental entrepreneur in that regard. And I would say it started with, so I'm half French, my father's French. I spent summers in France with my grandmother and traveling around Europe. And I realized that at a young age, I had a sensitivity to culture, to different country cultures, and that not everyone thinks like Americans, right? I learned the French culture and I learned Spanish culture. And so I hadn't appreciated the impact that had on me until I went first to Thunderbird, International Business School that I'd always wanted to go to. And I became aware of the importance of culture, not just country culture, but company culture. And I think I had a heightened sensitivity to it just from how I grew up. I spoke another language. I recognized people come with different points of view. Particularly at Thunderbird, I worked with Greeks and Italians and Australians on projects, and it made a more robust end product. Wow. And so that sensitivity, I think, is what, frankly, made it more of a struggle for me when I was going through these big multi-billion-dollar deals and there was culture conflict. And I kept thinking, we just have to work to figure out our language. We just have to work to figure out where's the commonality, right? And I knew that because, I'd been to France. I knew the common ground. I knew language, right? I knew, as a kid, I remember in the playground in the United States, people would say, "You're French?" Well, like, what's a swear word in French, right? That would always be the first merde would be, but people are fascinated to learn other languages. And so I thought we need to take that same curiosity and bring that into company culture.
Yes.
One of the exercises I do in my workshops is, if you want to make culture integration work, think like a tourist, right? And I have the whole group, we act as though we're going on a trip abroad. And what does that look like? And how do we prepare for that? And then bringing that same mindset to how you think about another company. And I find that helps open people's eyes up, and it comes from my experience. But I would have never even realized that had I not gotten into this work and realized, well, that's what's driving the sensitivity. It's just, that's how I grew up.
Jennifer, so let me dive into that. What inspired you to go deep into yourself to find that? Because sometimes I'm a firm believer that we all have these origin stories, and that sometimes when we take either these jobs or these particular roles, we're defined by what's in the requirements and what's in the expectations. But to really truly bring ourselves, we need to know ourselves really well. Into that work, right? And expand that work and expand that impact. It seems that you are living your calling. You're living through the work that you get to do. Tell us a little bit more about how you did that, in that self-reflection, define those areas, and going back and reflecting into your experience.
It was actually rewriting my bio. That exercise. I worked with a young lady, Carolyn Mays, who's brilliant, who said, bios are death. I mean, we've all, sat there when you read someone's bio and it's just like, oh my God, went to XYZ school, writes for these things. Even now, some of my stuff, I'm like, I got to really temper that down. And so working with her, she's the one who just kept asking me questions, right? My mom was a fashion model and my dad was a French diplomat. And I realized in how she kept asking me questions, I was like, oh my gosh, all of that as a kid growing up comes to the work that I do now. And I hadn't realized it until redoing my bio, and the cultural sensitivity really came out as I was thinking about my dad and the work that he did. But I wouldn't have known about it. So I guess I encourage people, redo your bio. It makes you more self-aware, and your bio will be less boring to other people.
Not only that, but I think sometimes when we talk about who we are, our first answer is, well, this is my title, or this is where I went to school, or this is what I went to school to get a title in. And therefore, that's kind of, it all encompasses that. But I love what you were just sharing. It's like, no, your bio is frankly what you're probably going to be reading when you pass away. Like, that is really your depthness of who you are. And that goes beyond just the industrial corporate side of who you are. It's more about the human piece as well, right? Like what makes you unique, right? I share this insight too especially with graduates when they graduate from either college or from high school, but more specifically college, because this is a little bit easier with them, is one of the insights I share with them is like, hey, you're probably sitting here in this graduation, you have 100 other people that are graduating with your exact same title, but each one of you is very unique. And what makes you unique is what you did outside of this classroom, before you walked into school, what you're going to do after this. Not all of you are going to be doing the same work, right? You might have the same job, but you're going to have different type of work because when you bring your full self into this space, those jobs will evolve, right? And the work will just, the more impactful work is that, right? Is when you're able to bring your full self. Jennifer, again, I'm so grateful that we've had a chance to have a conversation and go deeper into work that you're doing. Can you share with us a little bit more as we're wrapping up? One of the final questions I have for you, we're firm believers in these conversations that we've had with thought leaders, is that as the world gets more digital, it gives us the opportunity to be more human. But part of that too is that we're also becoming much more global. And I love that you shared that origin story with you. What is your vision? And now as we're going into, possibly the next decade, in the next few years, what is your call to action for all our audience members today if they're going through transitions, or they know that they will be going through transitions in the future, for them to be either better leaders or better employees going into the next decade or so?
I would love to make it sound as though I have something profound, something new that you've never thought of, but I really, and it plays out globally. I believe in the golden rule, right? Treat others as you would wish to be treated. And to me, when you keep that concept front and center, because we can get consumed by digital and all of the changes. Yeah. I did a talk a couple of years ago where I just said, we need to make time for people, right? How often does somebody say, hey, how are you? And then just keeps walking. Like they don't even stick around for the answer. And I'll say, but Alexa and Siri always have time for you, right? They always have time. I can always talk to Alexa and Siri. And so if human beings were literally giving up the role that we play to digital, chatbots and robots. And I have nothing against that. I think absolutely it has made us, it has strengthened us as humans. But what I worry about is us giving up the role that we play and the connection that we have.
So a human connection is more of a premium now than it was just 40 years ago. And we should acknowledge that and embrace those moments of human connection. Oh my God, I love that. Jennifer, with that said, you've shared with us so many insights today, but where could our audience members get some more information? After reading your book, of course, now what? Where can they get some more depthness into this work that you've talked to us about leadership, about culture, about transitions. What are been some of the books that have been some of your inspiration to dive into this work?
Definitely William Bridges, Managing Transitions, Surviving Corporate Transition. Okay. I read those books when I was going through my own merger and acquisition experiences. Frankly, he did the work upon which my work is based, right? The fact that you will go through a transition and how to navigate that. In the M&A change management space, John Cotter's leading change. Okay. But from a personal standpoint, I highly recommend Dory Clark's The Long Game.
Oh, yes. Okay.
I think it's a brilliant, it's just an insight that seems so obvious, right? How do you play the long game in a short attention span world, right? Where everything has to be immediate. And yet things like we're doing, right? I've created a role in mergers and acquisitions that didn't even exist. I'm playing the long game, but it can get frustrating as you wait for people to catch up and realize the value that you're bringing.
Oh my gosh.
And so I think her book, The Long Game, just is a great resource. And particularly when you keep having, discussions where you're like, oh my gosh, how long is it going to take for people to pivot and understand this is the way we need to move forward? It's a good reference to read to keep you going.
Yeah, I love that. And Jennifer, as we're wrapping up, one of the things I do also with all our guests is what question or questions you might have for me as we're wrapping up.
So one of the things that, as you said, business is accelerating and we are changing so quickly and dramatically. I find oftentimes I'm asking my kids for help and insights on technology. Do you think there will actually come a time where we're going to have humanists on the job that will be actually part of the workforce to remind people how to act like humans at work? Like, are we getting to that point? Could that even be possible?
No, that's a great question. It actually reminds me, at Intel, one of the previous companies I worked with, we had an anthropologist as part of our lead technology team. And so her study of human beings and understanding culture, understanding the diversity from different perspectives was critical in how technology was being built for individuals. Now, this is a role that was probably in place maybe 20, 30 years ago when I would argue there was a tech industry. I don't think there's a tech industry anymore. I believe everything is somewhat integrated into the tech sector. So therefore the question is, are we having those type of conversations, those type of roles or expertise in an auto dealership, as well as in a restaurant, as well as in a stadium, and as well as in a corporate office, right? Or what have you, or in a hotel. Yeah. Right? All those different aspects that touch our lives in some form or fashion, we need to be reminded or restart that conversation of the human piece of it. I do think more that we have an opportunity to lean into that human piece. Going back to your point about the long game and being much more thoughtful about, again, I think your signal in the noise was just treat others how you want to be treated. That's a very basic rule that no matter how fast AI is moving, no matter how fast change is happening, that's something that's always grounded us. We always look
Yep.
for a constant in all this change, and the constant's always been the human connection and how we treat each other as human beings. So if we focus on that, the work that's happening around us will constantly change, but we'll be ready for that change, to your point, if we focus on the human piece as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Jennifer, thank you again so much for joining me today. We'll have the link to your book and your book recommendations in our show notes. And again, thank you so much for joining us in the Future of the Human Experience.
It was great to be here and really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.